Okay, and let's begin. All right. So, welcome everybody to this thesis theatre in which we get to celebrate somebody's work at the end of a very long master's journey, and it's always a delight to do that. A couple of quick things before we get started. If you have any questions for Sarah, please could you put them in the Q&A rather than in the chat? And that's mostly because things tend to get lost if they're in the chat. The other thing is, if you do want to chat amongst yourselves, please do feel free, but make sure that you have set your chat to everyone and not the default hosts and panelists. Otherwise, the only person who's going to see what you want to say is me and not anybody else in the chat. So other than that, we will get started. So today we are going to have a thesis theatre with Sarah Nareen Shahan Polo, who has a deep fascination with the humanities, from fine art to dance to literature. She enjoys nitpicking at language, studying history, reading everything, and writing, which ultimately prompted her to pursue an education in English, finding particular solace in mythology and medievalism. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in English with an emphasis in teaching and linguistics, Master of Arts degree in English language and literature, and a minor degree in Old Testament biblical studies from Azusa Pacific University. In 2020, she joined Signum University to expand her knowledge of language and literature, particularly in Tolkien studies. She also has articles published in journals, including Malorn, which of course is the Journal of the Tolkien Society, the Cambridge Tolkien Society Journal, and The West Wind, as well as a children's book called The Purple Ballet Tree. Additionally, she has been an educator for 10 years, both as a ballet instructor and an English teacher. She's an adjunct professor at Azusa Pacific University and owns a literature and language school called Page Turner's Academy for young students. Sarah, do you ever sleep?
No.
No. Working with students brings her great joy, which is just as well because she never sleeps. And she hopes to cultivate a deep love for stories and language in them as they grow. She is married with one child, loves to cook, paint, garden, and clearly not sleep, and cannot wait to read The Hobbit to her daughter one day. Sarah, welcome to your thesis theatre.
Thank you.
Right. So what we're going to do, first of all, is I'm going to ask Sarah the very important question. Could you begin, please, by giving us a brief overview of your thesis?
Yes. So working on this thesis felt very similar to Alice trying to fit through the doorway. I was originally very interested in Tolkien's wordiness, the sheer amount of detail present in not only his primary work, but also secondary texts. To take it a step further, I've always been impressed with not just the quantity of his details, but the inter and intra connectivity throughout his work. The interweaving of linguistic, historical, mythical, structural detail stood out to me as a very, just an incredible feat of literature. And this led me to wonder about his literary context, what we now call the modern period, and how his work fit in there. Because the modern period carries a reputation for the advocacy of the death of detail. This then led me down some more rabbit holes until I was prompted to ask a deeper question. How has Tolkien's work been accepted over time, particularly in the 20th century, the postmodern and the modernist movements?
Sarah, do you have some slides to share with us?
Yes, I do. Let me just share my screen. Okay, let me know if you can see that.
Yep, I can see that.
Okay. All right. So there are several ways to interpret Tolkien's masterwork, The Lord of the Rings. Though Tolkien himself provides his perspective of his work's purpose in interviews and letters, authorial intention has no control over reader reception. Since its publication in 1955, several generations have read and enjoyed and eventually analyzed The Lord of the Rings. Particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, it was enthusiastically embraced by the postmodern sub-movement called the Counterculture. which thrived in the United States. Although Tolkien often defied any intentional participation or contribution to the contemporary literary movements of his day, his work nevertheless embodies qualities that reflect the counterculture and modernist movements, while still exemplifying the past literary influences that he cherished. Therefore, the text stands as an impeccable bridge between the ancient and the avant-garde. Certainly, The Lord of the Rings contains symbolism, linguistics, and characters distinctive of ancient literary traditions, suggesting that Tolkien succeeded in his endeavor to create a mythology for England, filling his narrative with cultural, philological, and figurative details that stem from customs like that of Northern mythology. However, his work also seems to navigate many realities that eventually were faced by the later 20th century audiences as well. The societal tumult of the American 60s and 70s, for instance, sparked by events like the Vietnam War, as well as the civil rights movements, feminist and environmentalist movements, created a space for The Lord of the Rings with its themes, characters, and intricate plotlines to be embraced. With its publication in 1955, The Lord of the Rings was not only anticipated by earlier 20th century audiences who eagerly awaited the sequel to The Hobbit, but it also became embraced by later 20th century people as well, particularly the postmodern Americans of the counterculture. Questions then begin to arise, such as how did Tolkien view his work and how was he received during the modernist and postmodernist movements? How do Tolkien's intentions for his work differ from his readers' interpretations and perceptions? And more specifically, what was it about Tolkien that spoke to the American counterculture of the 60s and 70s, and does it still resonate with each new generation? First, we begin with Tolkien's perspective and modernism. The breadth of the Lord of the Rings composition spans several years, approximately between 1937 and 1949, nestling Tolkien neatly at the height of the modernist period. With its start in the late 19th century, the genre found its peak after the First World War and is generally defined as a movement which sought to break away from traditional methods of written expression. The departure from the past literary forms for the modernist author fueled the intention to make it new, a phrase often associated with modernist poet Ezra Pound. The notion of breaking away from previous literary traditions appears to greatly conflict with the desires and motives of Tolkien and his writing. The modern author was meant to distance himself from a particular past or tradition that became regarded as naive. But any Tolkien scholar or enthusiast may quickly refute. Tolkien relished the ancient world and he wouldn't call it naive. His philology and approach to storytelling reveals his personal interest in rejecting such modernist paradigms. There are several ways in which Tolkien conflicts with the modernity of the 20th century. While modern literature championed fragmentation and nonlinearity, Tolkien uplifted mythic structure, chronology, and epic unity from the grave. While modern themes often revolve around alienation and disillusionment, Tolkien's world of Middle-earth is rooted in moral order, providence, and hope, though alienation and disillusionment could be arguable themes for certain characters. Modernism experimented with form and often relied on linguistic minimalism. Tolkien embraced traditional narrative forms, reminiscent of the Northern sagas and Anglo-Saxon epics. He cherished rural, pre-industrialized country and filled it with rich, archaically constructed languages. His conscious resistance to modern traits make it easy to fall into the mind trap that Tolkien is not a modern author, but a medievalist in a modern age. As Kenneth Craven writes, Tolkien was an ancient in the sense that he never wanted to live in the present time, but in saner ages and in eternity. Ralph Wood asserts in his final chapter that Tolkien regarded nearly everything worthy of praise in English culture to have ended in 1066. However, authorial intention has no power over reader reception. There are some, like Craven, who align themselves more with Tolkien and express an anti-modernist assessment. And there are those, like Wood, who suggest that Tolkien himself may have attempted to go against the grain of modernism. The events of the novel nevertheless embody the plights of modern as well as postmodern societies. Some might agree with scholar Brian Roseberry, who says, though Tolkien lived in the 20th century, he can hardly be called a modern writer. Roseberry also notes that The Lord of the Rings is antagonistic to the standards of modernism. In many ways, Roseberry might be correct because he aligns with Tolkien's intentions. Tolkien's lengthy writing style, his reverence for tradition, history, and literary convention do seem to starkly oppose the foundational qualities of modernism. However, this perspective is superficial as there is clear evidence that The Lord of the Rings does exemplify modern tenets when examined more thoroughly. Renowned Tolkien scholars reveal great insight regarding Tolkien's themes of trauma, war, loss of meaning, disenchantment, and existential struggle, each of which are also themes pertinent to modernism. Tom Shippey argues that Tolkien was a traumatized modernist who responded to the terrors of World War I via mythic structure and language. Verlyn Flieger, in her essay A Question of Time, explores Tolkien's use of time, memory, and loss, all concepts integral to the modernist plight. One publication in particular is Patchen Mortimer's Tolkien and Modernism, where he provides fascinating insights as to why Tolkien is not just a master of high fantasy, but also an integral author representative of the modern literary genre. He notes that countless readers consider Tolkien's work, as well as the attendant languages, histories, maps, artwork, and apocrypha, to be the greatest creative accomplishment of a modern author, and that Tolkien was just as avant-garde with the spirit of his age as Wagner, Eliot, Joyce, or Hemingway. Tolkien's work, when looked at beneath the surface, is certainly in line with the literary current of his era, and, as Mortimer claims, reveals modernist attributes that deserve to be explored. Mortimer continues that it would be naive to assert that Tolkien, born in 1892 and educated within the first decade of the 20th century, was not at least partly influenced by modern behavior. Yet his work is constantly critiqued in a way that divorces him from his contemporaries. This appears to be the failure of Tolkien's defenders. Tolkien's fit into modernity is a question that scholars must undertake. Why? Mortimer makes it clear. Tolkien was born and bred within the modernist period. To turn away from Tolkien's modernist context simply because he disliked the genre is to ignore entire generations' reception of his work and how such reception influences up-and-coming readers. One of the tenets of modernism found in the author's desire to reinvent art, to return to its roots and rebuild it. While many artists returned to the Greco-Roman roots to rebuild their art, Tolkien took the idea of returning to roots one step further when he decided to re-excavate the antiquity of the British Isles and Scandinavia. It is to be noted that Tolkien's work is not a retelling of the myths and histories he found there. He tried to build new ground as if from scratch. Not only is Tolkien's rebuilding from the roots, but he is simultaneously upholding modernism's principle of clearing new ground. Tolkien's drawing from the myths and sagas of the Anglo-Saxons, Celts, and Scandinavians, however, is not without cost. Since Tolkien did not mine the rubble of ancient Greece and Rome, modern Western people generally are unaware of Tolkien's northern precursors. This reveals that somewhere along the way, Greco-Roman myths and retellings had not only become popular, but standard, narrowing the common knowledge of literature and excluding a plethora of other traditions. This then leads audiences to believe that Tolkien's work is not modern, but strictly fantasy. In reality, it is simply because the northern sources that Tolkien worked with were largely unknown compared to that of Greece and Rome. The search for identity is also a modernist ideal that Tolkien's legendarium upholds. The search for definition of the self is quintessentially modern. American authors were particularly immersed in this, as seen in the works of Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Faulkner. According to Mortimer, within the American perspective, there is no myth that anchors American identity. With this, he writes, Tolkien must have had obvious sympathies. Thus, Tolkien aims to create a mythology suitable for England, providing and sustaining an identity that can be held on into the future. The desire to map out an identity and geography for one's people is a modern desire. Whether English or American, the cultural desire for identity is strong, especially in the wake of war. Within the same vein lies the next component of modernism seen in Tolkien's writing, which is the experience of war. Mortimer argues that a key trait to modernist literature is the grappling with the horrors of the age. Particularly in Lord of the Rings, Tolkien explores the 20th century horrors head on. His use of fantasy is not escapist, but strategic for articulating the awful and the inexplicable. Next, Tolkien is his most modern, not in his descriptions of war, but in its aftermath. Modern works which stand the test of time are not necessarily the ones that focus on the war, but of what comes afterwards, when people are trying to make sense of what just happened. Mortimer references Eliot's The Wasteland, Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, and others. He also claims that among these authors and their works should join Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, particularly The Return of the King. For the true concern is not just the defeat of Sauron, but the passing of the Third Age. This is a unique comparison that holds major significance. Even though there is victory, there is still cost. The time after the war is to be grappled with just as much as the war itself. Tolkien dedicates chapters of this time in Middle-earth to the hobbits' return home, their discomfort there, the rejuvenation of the Shire. He works through the long-term pains of Frodo, the developing rule of men, and a new quest for rest, though for most it does not come. Lastly, Tolkien, says Mortimer, is engaged in a delicate balancing act. He must mourn the past while facing the future. Through his work, Tolkien uses the tools of the past to deal with his present and what is to come. Tom Shippey claims that unlike Robert Graves, Tolkien never said goodbye to all that. It is evident in Return of the King when Sam tells Frodo, I thought you were going to enjoy the Shire too, for years and years after all you have done. To which Frodo replies, so I thought too once. Such epiphanies are characteristically modern and are never without sorrow. Tolkien knew this, and Mortimer ends with the words of Gandalf, I will not say do not weep, for not all tears are an evil. Ultimately, The Lord of the Rings appears to embrace several aspects of modernism. Mortimer is not alone in his arguments either. Tom Shippey also takes Mortimer's claims one step further by narrowing in on how Tolkien's war experience reveals insights as to how Tolkien fits into modernism. He goes into detail, comparing Tolkien to other post-war authors like Lewis, White, Orwell, and Golding. While Shippey acknowledges the differences between these men, both personally and literarily, he nevertheless claims that ultimately Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings were not quite as isolated in their nature and appeal as they may have seemed. Additionally, it seems arguable that the major works of English fiction in the post-war decade were more like each other, more like Tolkien, than critical orthodoxy would accept. Shippey notes that each of these authors experienced World War I personally, and it became apparent that their perceptions of war did not simply influence their surface-level plots or characters, but rather something with far greater depth, that is, the nature and the origins of evil. Given that these men experienced World War I and still lived through World War II before their major works were published, Shippey acknowledges that the phrase post-war writer could mean more than one thing. However, this time frame of experience allows these authors a mutual motive to define evil and from there explore its justification, if any, and its origins. Shippey continues his argument in this manner, ultimately concluding in a similar way to Mortimer, positing that Tolkien is his most modern when dealing with the aftermath of war and the horrors that persisted long after the last bullet was shot. This is perhaps what enticed the next generation, the postmodern, to latch onto Tolkien. One of the most fascinating aspects of Tolkien's work is how it endures. Eventually, the question of are Tolkien and his work modern turns into are Tolkien and his work postmodern? This question arises out of necessity, since The Lord of the Rings gained great fame in the latter half of the 20th century, particularly in the United States. Preceding the modern era lies the postmodern. The term counterculture, specifically in America, refers to the social movement rejective of dominant cultural norms and societal values, instead promoting alternative lifestyles, political beliefs, and the challenging of the status quo. The term was originally coined by Theodore Roszak in his 1969 book, The Making of a Counterculture. The term was meant to exemplify how the youth movement turned away from technocracy and materialism towards spirituality, ecology, and alternative lifestyles. There are several subgroups within this postmodern counterculture: the beatnik generation of the 50s, the hippies of the 60s and 70s, the steampunk movement, and the grunge scene of the 80s and 90s. The generations of anti-war activists, civil rights advocates, and feminists who embraced beliefs in love, environmentalism, spiritual exploration, and personal liberation eventually led to anti-authoritarians and rebellious youth. Yet no matter what decade or genre, the core characteristics stood fast: a countercultural group pushing against the grain in hopes of stimulating great change. So, how does conservative English author John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, esteemed mythmaker and creator of Middle-earth, resonate with this American counterculture? How does it endure, and how does it champion the postmodern? Why would Tolkien have accepted the countercultural's view of his work? During the 60s and 70s in particular, The Lord of the Rings became a touchstone for generations rejecting mainstream politics, avarice, and war. Despite Tolkien's personal conservatism, The Lord of the Rings contains themes that strongly resonate with the counterculture. The story's idyllic idealism, environmental awareness, and anti-industrial air appealed to a generation disillusioned by modernity. The Shire, with its humble hobbit people and their simple agrarian lifestyle and love for nature, stands in stark contrast to the mechanized, contaminated landscapes of Isengard and Mordor. This dichotomy mirrored a real-world anxiety between natural living and the rise of technocratic capitalism and industrial development. Environmentalists and hippies in particular embraced Tolkien's embedded warning about the destruction of the natural world. Treebeard and the Ents became symbols of environmental activism. Tolkien's critique of power and domination, embodied by the corrupting influence of the One Ring, resonated with young people protesting Vietnam, racial injustice, and authoritarian governments. Tolkien's wariness of centralized power and totalitarian regimes found unexpected fans in anti-establishment groups. Though Tolkien had served in World War I and abhorred allegory, many readers interpreted his work as an allegorical critique of the 20th century warfare and the military-industrial complex. During the Vietnam War, young Americans found the Fellowship of the Ring narrative that paralleled their own struggles. The hobbits, unlikely heroes, small and unassuming, challenging dark and immense forces, inspired grassroots resistance movements. Slogans like "Frodo lives" began to appear on buttons, bumper stickers, and graffiti, symbolizing a quiet but profound resistance to what they viewed as oppressive systems. Yet, for all the enthusiasm and praise of these new readers, Tolkien did not align himself with the counterculture of the 60s and 70s. Though we may not be able to call Tolkien and his work postmodernist, there are nevertheless key components of the counterculture that resonate with The Lord of the Rings, fueling its influence upon the late American 20th century. First, Tolkien places heavy emphasis on nature, its beauty, its resourcefulness, and the necessity to steward it. While Tolkien cannot be called an environmentalist by today's standards, he was nevertheless called a proto-environmentalist by scholars such as Sophie Butler, Patrick Curry, Matthew Dickerson. While there are a plethora of examples for Tolkien's love and respect for nature, one of the most poignant perhaps comes from the Fellowship of the Ring, when Frodo enters Lothlorien for the first time, seeing its beauty and the weight of its timelessness upon him. That particular passage establishes Tolkien's romantic view of nature as timeless, healing, and sacred. Lothlorien is portrayed nearly as a preserved Eden, untainted by the industrialization and destruction present elsewhere in Middle-earth. The natural beauty evokes deep emotion, memory, and peace, common threads in Tolkien's writing about nature. There are several other passages that exemplify Tolkien's perspectives on the natural world, from the purity of Lothlorien to the grandeur of Rivendell, the idyllic beauty of the Shire. Even on the gruesome, tiresome road to Mordor, characters like Samwise are able to look into the sky and find hope through the natural world. In contrast to this, there are places like Mordor and Isengard. Even cities such as Osgiliath and Moria portray industry's destructive presence on nature. In the Two Towers, Sauron's transformation of Isengard from a beautiful green valley of ancient trees into an industrial wasteland is a powerful metaphor for how the natural world can quickly and easily be destroyed by unchecked power. The stark contrast between places like the Shire and Isengard have dubbed Tolkien as a proto-environmentalist. Within the postmodern world, this characteristic certainly helped establish a connection between Tolkien and the countercultural movement. Doyle writes that The Lord of the Rings gave readers of the 60s and 70s an escape from the strife of their time, strife that was directly visible on a daily basis for the first time thanks to the television and Technicolor. What is conflicting here is that while Tolkien did not intend for his work to exemplify any modern world event or idea, at least in the allegorical sense, he was unwaveringly against postmodern efforts. The postmodern audiences, however, still imbued their own experiences onto his work, forming connections of their own and deeming The Lord of the Rings a multifaceted manifesto. In addition to the idea of promoting the importance of nature in of itself, another countercultural tenet is simply living a quiet, peaceful life, promoted by connecting to nature on a spiritual level. While a great part of The Lord of the Rings has to do with cherishing and preserving nature, Tolkien's love of the natural world ultimately stems from his conservative theological vision. On the other hand, the countercultural's return to nature was rebellious and experimental. People of the counterculture viewed nature to be spiritual in of itself, often rejecting any traditional theological influence. Their connection to nature was often shaped by Eastern spirituality or pantheism, discarding Western traditional religion altogether. Tolkien, however, was a devout Catholic who believed that respect and stewardship of nature is due to its creation by God. Tolkien was reverent of nature, but he was not worshipful of it. Additionally, Tolkien consistently used the natural world as a means of demonstrating morally complex behavior. Creatures and characters who appreciated and understood nature, like Samwise, Gandalf, the elves, are good and overall successful in the outcome of the text. Those like that of the orcs, Saruman, and Sauron, who are either defiled or greedily spoil nature, are evil and ultimately disastrous. There are even parts of Middle-earth that are not entirely evil, but not entirely benign either. Old Man Willow or the Wilds come to mind. It is clear then that Tolkien created a spectrum of nature in Lord of the Rings that conveys his approach and beliefs about the natural world. Consequently, this spectrum was viewed by the counterculture to uphold various truths that supported their evolving belief system. While Tolkien and the counterculture shared basic qualities regarding the natural world, Tolkien wanted to protect a timeless way of life, but the counterculture wanted to create a new one. Tolkien was not anti-civilization. He valued order, tradition, and rooted culture, as seen with races like the hobbits and the elves. Yet the counterculture wanted to break from that tradition and dismantle the establishment. Both cherished nature, but they walked through their forests for very different reasons. Not only did the countercultural environmentalists latch onto The Lord of the Rings, but so did other subgroups, and not always in an initially positive way. Feminists of the era had mixed feelings regarding the text and Tolkien, especially during the 1960s when second-wave feminism was gaining momentum. One of the most common feminist critiques of this time was the lack of female representation in the novel. While with the narrative being predominantly male-centric, most of the action and decision-making are reserved for male characters: Frodo, Aragorn, Gandalf, Theoden. The few prominent female characters in the novel, Éowyn, Arwen, Galadriel, do appear to have limited roles. At least that is the feminist critique. Some of the critics of the 60s onward of those women say that the women are too restricted to stereotypical feminine roles. Feminist scholar Catherine Stimson argued in 1969 that Tolkien's female characters were hackneyed stereotypes, either beautiful and distant, or simply simple. She criticized the novel for being a story about men for boys, with minimal and underdeveloped female characters. Other scholars have similar sentiments to Stimson and have suggested that Tolkien's female characters are not only limited stereotypes, but negative stereotypes at that. The Endwives are lost, the dwarf women are ugly, and Goldberry is dreamily mystical and therefore unrelatable and inaccessible. However, ironically, though the initial 60s feminist reaction to The Lord of the Rings is heavily critiqued, the novel since then has garnered much feminist support. Tolkien scholar Carol Leibiger, I think that's how we pronounce it, disproves Stimson's claim by diving deeper into the characterization of Éowyn and several other women found in the Silmarillion, like Luthien. Leibiger specifically writes in Women in Tolkien's Works that the primary women of The Lord of the Rings are extremely powerful in their own right. Ralph Wood also responds to Stimson by stating that Galadriel, Éowyn, and Arwen are far from being stereotypical feminine tropes. He argues that Galadriel is powerful. Much of her strength and achievement are portrayed in the Silmarillion, while her wisdom is necessary in The Lord of the Rings. Éowyn has extraordinary courage and valor, and Arwen does not just give up her immortality, but she gifts her spot to the west to Frodo. And she is the reason Frodo can achieve healing and a proper reward. Additionally, Nancy Einright claims that the absence of women in fellowship or from battle, excepting Éowyn, does not mean that female presence or power are not important in the narrative. Instead, Einright insists that women epitomize Tolkien's own critique of the conventional use of power. He employs women to convey what he thought was the most important quality of his Christian Catholic faith. Selfless love and sacrifice are stronger than selfish pride and domination. Finally, one must remember Tolkien's own life experience. As a soldier, there were no women alongside him on the battlefield, no female footmen to return to, no female officer with impending news or urgent orders. As a professor, there were hardly, if any, female colleagues during his time at Oxford. And even as a young boy, after the unfortunate death of his mother, there were not many girls his age in his midst, and the TCBS was comprised of his fellow male companions. Veronica Lashkewicz's statement seems most fitting. Tolkien's heroines have been both praised and severely criticized. Since the counterculture movement of the 60s, the spectrum of feminist criticism has only continued developing over the decades. It seems that the initial negativity towards Tolkien and his female characters from feminist groups was the spark necessary for latter readers and scholars to join the conversation and take a look at Tolkien's women. This has extended the feminist view of Tolkien to one that currently not only appears quite positive of his female characters, but also empathetic of Tolkien's personal early 20th century context. The next pillar of postmodern counterculture is anti-war sentiment. Tolkien illustrates the various literary shades of heroism through the entire narrative. The unexpected hero, Samwise and Frodo; the tragic hero, Boromir and Frodo; the epic hero, Aragorn; the sacrificial hero, mainly Frodo, but several others too. Aligning with the counterculture was the idea that a hero could be small and come from humble beginnings. Someone who is often overlooked can rise to do great things. Additionally, the counterculture has also shifted focus from the traditional hero to a new kind of hero, the failed hero, Frodo. How does this type of heroism fit into the counterculture's anti-war sentiment? We can answer this question by examining the counterculture's long experience with the Vietnam War. The experience for many soldiers proved similar to that of the soldiers who fought in World Wars I and II, hit with the realization that there is no pure victory. Everybody loses something. At first, many men believed that their services were a small part of a larger fight against communism and that the fight for freedom and democracy was their patriotic duty and personal mission. However, by the end of the war, many soldiers and civilians became disillusioned, primarily because this is the first living room war, broadcast via television. Soldiers in Vietnam experienced corruption, poor leadership, and confusing objectives. Some resented the draft, and anxiety and dread steadily grew, following them into the battlefield. They felt morally shaken, not always able to tell friend from enemy. This all resulted in the social paradigm shift regarding the definition of heroism. No longer was the traditional hero thrown atop the people's shoulders and celebrated for their strength and victory. This change of definition challenged traditional values concerning integrity and rebellion against unjust authority. The counterculture began to stir up a deep fascination with what eventually became known as the failed hero, someone who resists, struggles, or rebels, but ultimately falls short, is broken, or is destroyed by the powers that be. Instead of simply seeing these figures as disappointments, they were embraced as more genuine heroes than the traditional triumphant ones. For members of the counterculture, failure did not equate to weakness. Instead, it represented authenticity and humility in the face of a corrupt system, ultimately achieving almost martyr-like status. Thus, the famous phrase, "Frodo lives," was scribbled along subway walls, bumper stickers, and t-shirts. Frodo Baggins, Tolkien's humble ring bearer of the Lord of the Rings, fits the countercultural idea of the failed hero perfectly. Frodo is not a warrior nor a king. He is not even a man. He is a hobbit, small in size and therefore also an influence within Middle-earth. Frodo represents the common man in the eyes of the counterculture. He reflects their alternative view of heroism by being someone who suffers immensely, struggles against unchecked power and corruption, resists that power, yet is wounded in the process and ultimately fails his mission. As stated previously, this failure was not to suggest weakness, but great moral substance. After enduring terrible suffering on the journey to Mordor, carrying the burden of the ring, Frodo succumbs to the temptation and cannot throw the ring into the flames. Through the traditional lens, this is a complete failure of the quest, made all the more heartbreaking when knowing just how much he, as well as his companions, have suffered to get to this point. Frodo fails, yes, but his mercy towards Gollum ultimately completes the quests and saves Middle-earth. This holds enormous implications regarding the nature of victory within the counterculture. From a countercultural perspective, Frodo's failure reveals the corruptive nature of power, the limitations of personal will, and that true victory often does not come through dominance or force, but through humility and mercy. Frodo's countercultural heroism doesn't end there. He survives the war, but he is forever wounded, at first physically, and then eventually emotionally and spiritually too. He cannot return home to the Shire as he once was. As a failed, wounded hero, he returns home disillusioned, like the soldiers of Vietnam. Frodo tells Sam in Return of the King that there is no real going back. Though Frodo may have come to the Shire, it will not be the same. In this passage, Frodo accepts that he has undergone immense transformation during his journey that no one will quite understand. His life and his home have altered him forever. This echoes the counterculture's idea that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Once the darkness has been seen, there is no unseeing it. Due to this, Frodo is ultimately relinquishes his leadership in the Shire. He does not desire it. He does not want any glory or recognition for his suffering or great feat. Instead, he sails quietly into the West for spiritual release and final peace. This aligns with the counterculture's emphasis on leaving a corrupted world for a calmer, purer society. Overall, throughout the narrative, Frodo relies on humility, mercy, and nonviolence. Unlike the traditional hero, who often works solo, Frodo needs the help of others, especially Sam, to get through his journey. He learns quickly that power is a burden that festers, and it's best to reject. Lastly, he is saved by mercy, not strength. He cannot reintegrate himself with his fellow hobbits, and his trauma follows him for the rest of his days, until he departs for the West. Many 1960s and 70s readers, especially Vietnam veterans and activists, saw themselves in Frodo. He was not a warrior, but a sufferer. He did not always fight with weapons, but by preserving and enduring his struggles. When he won, it did not feel like victory. When it comes to heroism, Tolkien was greatly shaped by his Catholic morality, medieval literature, and his own World War I experience. He valued humility and service, moral endurance, and self-sacrifice, and this is evident in his 1963 letter to Eileen Elgar. Frodo indeed failed as a hero, he says. Readers tend to forget that strange element in the world called pity or mercy, which is also an absolute requirement in moral judgment. His suffering, Frodo's sufferings, were justly rewarded by the highest honor, and his exercise of patience and mercy towards Gollum gained him mercy. His failure was redressed. The overall nature of The Lord of the Rings reveals a longing for peace, not glory. Both Tolkien and the counterculture share many of these qualities when it comes to heroism, as seen by Frodo's personal journey. However, their roots differ. While Tolkien was grounded in Catholic faith, accepted moral absolutes, and emphasized the importance of hierarchy, and believed in divine order, the counterculture was spiritual but not religious, untrusting of any hierarchy or divine order, and embraced moral complexity and even ambiguity. This is all to say that while Tolkien would have not identified with the postmodern counterculture, just as he personally did not identify with the modernists, that does not mean that the counterculture did not identify with him. Even though there is authorial intent, readers spanning the late 20th century with varying beliefs still found meaning in Tolkien's work. To paraphrase Tom Shippey, while Tolkien may have looked backward to a medieval Christian ideal, many of his readers looked at Frodo and saw a fellow protester with a backpack rather than a warrior with a sword. Tolkien's heroes reflect service, sacrifice, and strife between good and evil, and that the often overlooked little person can do great, influential things. The counterculture's heroes symbolize defiance, doubt, and moral complexity, and they supported the idea that the common person should not be overlooked nor manipulated by the powers that be. Both perspectives of heroism honor those who suffer for others, reject domination, and believe that true heroism does not lie in violence or glory, but spirit and sacrifice. Thus, The Lord of the Rings, while intended to be a novel reflective of ancient literary themes and structures, in addition became emblematic of the experiences dealt with by modern audiences throughout the 20th century and beyond. Out of all of Tolkien's works, The Lord of the Rings specifically stands out for its timelessness and applicability. Although Tolkien himself objected to much of the modern and postmodern ideal, the resonation of these movements with his work suggests that not even Tolkien had complete control over his story and its interpretation. Though Tolkien had specific intentions for the design of his mythology and had given himself a measured scope for its purpose, it nevertheless succeeded in blowing those boundaries apart. The Lord of the Rings application and acceptance within movements like modernism and postmodernism reveal the significant central themes, characters, and key events are not bound by time period, language, culture, or race. Throughout its entirety, The Lord of the Rings champions hope in darkness, loyalty and fellowship, fortitude of morality, peace over glory, delicacy of the natural world, and the corruptive nature of power and domination. These themes are not restricted to time or fashion. They are recurrent human concerns that every generation must deal with, and therefore Tolkien's story endures. Additionally, though Tolkien believed in the existence of good and evil, The Lord of the Rings presents readers with morally conflicting characters. Gollum is malicious, but he is torn, tragic, and pitiable. Boromir is valiant, but he is flawed. Frodo is heroic, but broken. Tolkien thoroughly and elegantly illustrated the complexity of morality in his characters, which not only makes it feel more realistic for readers, but more personal. Though we may hate to admit it, we too have experienced being morally gray. Tolkien's characters are relatable in this sense, and consequently, we feel closer to and are more understanding of not just their successes, but their failures. The movements of modernism and postmodernism are distinguished by their responses to ethics, human suffering, and social changes. While they are remembered as unique, transformative time periods within our recent history and have their definitive traits, they are nevertheless at least have one thing in common. They share a deep fascination with the work of J.R.R. Tolkien. And as we have seen now in the 21st century, This fascination only continues to grow. While the primary question of this thesis was limited to modern and postmodern timeframes, it could easily be adjusted to the technological age of today's world. One could swiftly wonder, does Tolkien's work resonate with today's audiences? The short answer, I would suspect, is yes. Despite Tolkien's great efforts, The Lord of the Rings is not just a myth for England, it is a myth for mankind. And myths, when told with truth and heart, never die. Thank you.
That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you for sharing that with everybody as well. So let's get into a few questions that I have for you. And just a reminder for anybody who's watching, if you have any questions or comments for Sarah, please do feel free to put them in the Q&A. If you want to talk amongst each other, make sure you've got the chat set to everyone and not just to panelists and hosts. Okay, so Sarah, you had a lot of really interesting things to say about authorial intentionality. So my question to you is, can an author truly control how their work is interpreted once it enters the public sphere? And even should they be able to?
So my initial response to that is no. Roland Barthes' death of the author concept comes to mind. If we consider reader reception theory, once a work is published and it is out of the author's hands, it now lives within the reader's mind. Readers' minds are, of course, shaped by their own context, beliefs, histories. And so the text becomes a part of them, influenced by that background. Barth also argued that meaning of the text arises through the interaction of the text between the text and the reader. And sometimes there are authorial blind spots. Sometimes an author doesn't realize how much of themselves they put into a text, making the work much more complicated and there's a lot more to unpack for the reader than the author realizes. If I'm able to quote a pop culture reference, I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
Dave Grohl has this amazing musical quote where he says, you can sing a song to 80,000 people and they will sing it back to you for 80,000 different reasons. And I think that sentiment applies here as well.
Oh, I love that. I love that. That's really great. Thank you. You were also talking about the reception of Tolkien's work. So my next question to you is, why do you think contemporary readers tend not to associate Tolkien's work with other modern texts?
So I think there's a couple answers to this question. First, as we saw with Patchen Mortimer's text, he explains that one of the qualities of modernity that Tolkien does embody is the rebuilding of art, excavating the roots. However, while most of Western society at that time was excavating the Greco-Roman roots, Tolkien was excavating the Scandinavian roots, the Celtic roots, British Isles. So this causes a rift between the two, where the general society is aware of ancient myths of ancient Greece and Rome, but not necessarily are they aware of Old Norse myths or Celtic myths. So Tolkien's work becomes almost separated. I think the word he uses is divorced from his contemporaries, simply because there is not that awareness of that particular ancient tradition. So this, however, is a great fault, especially for if you call yourself a Tolkien fan. To just say that Tolkien is a fantasy writer is very limiting, and it narrows the scope of his work drastically, leading us to not be able to appreciate it as much.
No, great, thank you. But the 1960s and 1970s counterculture, which you were talking so eloquently about a few minutes ago, you noted that they really strongly identified with The Lord of the Rings. Why do you think that is so, despite Tolkien's personal conservatism?
Yes. So I think that goes back to our discussion on authorial intent versus reader reception. Ultimately, the counterculture embraced Lord of the Rings not because Tolkien shared their worldview, but because his myth gave symbolic expression of their worldview, even if unintentionally. So the identification was strong because of themes like anti-industrialism, environmentalism, alternative heroism, and longing for spiritual meaning. This was a generation looking for meaning, and
Mm,
Tolkien's text gives them that. The counterculture didn't need Tolkien to be on their side.
mhm.
Essentially, The Lord of the Rings became a mirror reflective of themselves, even if Tolkien was looking in the other direction.
Yeah, I like that idea of the book actually being a mirror anyway. Okay, so my next question to you is, um, you noted Tolkien's depiction of war being different to other post-war authors, authors like George Orwell and Kurt Vonnegut. In what ways would you say that his depiction of war differ to those other authors?
So the primary differences are in tone, purpose, and moral outlook. Tolkien depicts war through the epic mythological lens. There is clarity in the stakes between good and evil. Orwell uses allegory directly. We see this in Animal Farm specifically to critique totalitarianism. Vonnegut uses satire and absurdism to show war's futility, like in Slaughterhouse-Five. So while Tolkien depicts that war is tragic, but sometimes necessary in order to defeat evil, whereas authors like Orwell and Vonnegut um, express that war is ultimately futile in that endeavor. Um, we see in Shippey's article that what connects Tolkien to other modern authors in regards to warfare is not that they are is that they are all interested in warfare and the origins of evil and the natures of evil. They grapple with that in different ways, but they nevertheless uphold this modern plight that they're just trying to figure it out. They're trying to deal with it.
Mhm. Okay. Um, so you were talking about where Tolkien's work kind of fits with modernism. So if we can dig into that a little bit, in what ways do you think The Lord of the Rings challenges or reinforces modernist literary conventions, like, for example, fragmentation or ambiguity or alienation?
Mhm. So while Tolkien primarily differs in form from modern literature, as touched on before, he does reinforce modern and postmodern themes, alienation and disillusionment. We see this with Frodo's return from war emotionally and physically scarred. We see that there's an echo of modernity's tendency towards internal exile, such as Eliot's The Wasteland or Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. We see also trauma and psychological turmoil. There's a plethora of characters that undergo this. Frodo, Gollum, Eowyn, Theoden, Denethor, Boromir, they all display psychological complexity, which is a hallmark of modern literature. Deterioration from carrying the ring parallels modernist exploration of fragmentation or identity crisis. There's a lot of moral ambiguity in modernism, while Tolkien preferred a clear moral compass. He still includes moral ambiguity in characters like Gollum or Boromir.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions I like to ask my students when they come to their thesis theatre is, while you are going through writing your thesis, and this happens to virtually everybody, there comes a point where you realize you've got too much and you have to get rid of some points that you actually really like, but you can't keep them because of the word limit. Was there anything like that for you with your thesis? Were there any points that you would have loved to included, but you just couldn't because of the word limit?
Yes. Um, as you know, I'm a very wordy person, and I probably already went over my time. But several points I had that I found so interesting that I couldn't make. One of them was, um, how in today's society, not just early 20th or late 20th century, but in the 21st century, how does Tolkien's work resonate? And as I mentioned briefly at the end, it does still resonate with us, and I think it will continue to resonate with for future generations. I think that the more time between Tolkien's publication and the audience, actually, the more resonation there seems to be. Whereas with other works and other texts, um, the further away we get from publication, the more distance there is, the more we have to do a little bit more homework to try to understand. For some reason, it feels like the opposite with Tolkien, where the further away from the publication date we get, the more we um, the more we find meaning in his text, and maybe that there's a lot of reasons for that. Um, so we not only find, current academic interest in Tolkien, which is continuing to expand, but we continue to find personal solace in his work. That was another point I wanted to discuss. There's comfort in characters like Samwise and Aragorn. There's comedy in Gollum at times, as well as sorrow. Tolkien provides audiences with what they desire in their own lives: friendship, comfortable home, a chance at redemption, the fulfillment of hope. These are things we strive for throughout our life. Um, and Tolkien's characters are relatable, and his plot lines echo our own in a time where truth has often become blurred by technology, politics, what have you. Tolkien's work offers a sort of mental and emotional cleanse. It feels like a reset button to realign ourselves a little bit, our eyes, our hearts. And even though his form might be mythic, the truths in that form transcend time and fashion.
Lovely. Since 2020, you've been at Signum, moving along on your path to get to this point here. And nobody does it with a hey nonny nonny saying this is easy, because it's not easy. You've had to work very, very hard to get to this point. So I'd love to finish with this final question, which is another one that I like to ask my students, which is, would you have any advice for those Signum students who are about to embark on their thesis? What would you tell them? What would you like to have known for yourself just before embarking on yours?
Yes, I do. So, my advice is that the idea you start with may not be the idea you end with, and that's
Mm,
okay. That's a good thing because that means that there was a lot of growth in between. And even if it takes some extra time, um, that's okay. It's good to accept critique. It's good to accept other people's perspectives on your work because that just allows you to grow. So if the idea you start off with doesn't end up being the argument that you end with, it's okay. It's nothing to be upset about. I mean, initially it might be upsetting, but that's where the work comes in and that's where the growth comes in. And it's okay.
I think that's excellent advice. I really do. And for those thesis students who get to listen to what Sarah just said, take that on board because that is absolutely excellent advice. And Sarah, that is it. We are done. And I would like everybody who has come here to participate, to listen, to enjoy this moment with you, to celebrate with me that you have finished your master's, you have completed an excellent thesis, and congratulations to you. I'm absolutely delighted for you, Sarah. Well done.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, everybody who has come along today and listened to Sarah give her presentation on her excellent work. There's congratulations coming through in the chat for you, Sarah. People rightly saying what a grand job you have done. And I hope that you are as proud of yourself as I am, and I'm sure your family are of you today.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody, thank you so much for coming along today. I hope to see you at a future Thesis Theatre. And once again, congratulations, Sarah, and I look forward to seeing you at your graduation next year.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.